Very good to be here, and thanks for the opportunity to talk about this. We all hear a lot, obviously, about climate and climate change. But what I want to talk about is something very specific, which is how climate issues affect religion. And I'm going to make a claim that might sound very surprising, which is if you look at the history of religion, particularly of Christianity, so many of the most important things we think about have arisen as a result of dramatic moments of climate change. And that I think this is going to set a pattern for the coming decades as climate change does hit us much more, that what we see 200, 300 years ago will be what we will be seeing in coming decades in different parts of the world. So very rough summary. There have been repeated moments of climate shocks through history, and you can date them particularly. You know, there's one around 1680, there's one around 1740, and so on. And you may think, well, okay, this is ancient history, so what? But what I will argue is if you're interested in the history of, say, evangelical Christianity or the Catholic Church as it develops, you have to understand it in relation to that. When a climate shock happens, when, for instance, there is appalling weather, when people are starving, when there are epidemics which grow out of climate, how do people react? Well, today, you know, we go around and complain a lot. But in earlier generations, people turned to religious responses. Let me just give you an example. If you're interested in the history of Christianity in America, one of the things we always start with, and we always quote in like a college class, is a sermon given by Jonathan Edwards, great Puritan, in the year 1741. And it has the wonderfully cheerful and encouraging title, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. And you may remember this from a class in English or speech communication or rhetoric or history or whatever. And it's one of the most terrifying sermons that you'll ever hear. And it basically says, look, you are all dreadful sinners. It is amazing that God has put up with you so long. At any moment, he may snuff out your life. You'll be burning in hell. You are absolutely dependent on his whim. And that's one of the most important sermons in American history for a couple of reasons. For one thing, the response was astonishing. As you can see, it was attended with remarkable impressions on many of the hearers, and people were screaming and fainting and pleading for mercy. But it also was a big thing in launching what we call the Great Awakening in the 18th century. When you look at evangelical Christianity, you look at born-again religion, it all tracks back to this great sermon, and that's why it's written about so much. What has this got to do with weather? Jonathan Edwards was preaching at a period which was after 2 years of the worst weather in the previous 500 years around the Atlantic. There were 10-foot snowdrifts across New England. Much of the sea off the New England coast was frozen. Around Europe, around North America, it was a time of incredible starvation. There was cannibalism around the place. So now you move forward to that July, when Jonathan Edwards says, you have no hope, you're totally dependent on God, you're going to listen. And probably you're going to be in such a sense of emotional chaos when you hear this sermon, you are going to yell and scream and plead for mercy, and you are ready to be converted. Now look, that's one incident out of a great many. But here's the interesting thing. Historians have been writing about that sermon for the last 250 years and saying how important it is. But as far as I can tell, no one has ever said, oh, by the way, everyone listening to that was coming out of this incredibly horrible period of climate. I'm certainly not going to do a history of climate, but there are a couple of things which are helpful to know. From the late 13th century through to the 19th century, we're in something called the Little Ice Age, when temperatures were really incredibly cold. But that within that ice age, there are eras when the weather strikes big time. Oh, by the way, I just want to say one thing that is so important here, and it's like a preface to everything. Some people will say there was incredible bad weather in the past, bad climate in the past, so we needn't worry about climate change today. It's just going to come and go. That's absolutely not what I'm saying. Climate change back then had very specific reasons, totally different from what we get today. Okay, do not accuse me of that. So why did climate change? A couple of reasons. Volcanoes around the world throw up a huge amount of mess and what's called ejecta, which darkens the atmosphere and results in cooling. That is a picture of Krakatoa, famous volcano from the 1880s. Nothing unusual in human history, and in the Little Ice Age, these volcanoes were hitting very fast. They were very frequent. There's a great phrase that people use, by the way. They rank volcanoes. So Krakatoa was called a colossal, which is a grade 6. But there are also what we call super colossals, which is a grade 7, and they hit some of those. And that meant your temperature was going to drop dramatically, food supplies were going to become much shorter. And there's also, where do you go above super colossal? You go to mega colossal, and there hasn't been one of those in tens of thousands of years, thank heaven, and I hope we never see one. Well, this is a super colossal. It's one that's in the lifetime of many of us. It happened in 1991 in the Philippines at a place called Pinatubo. And if you don't remember it, well, that's fine, because we have our food supplies in good order. We can store food. We can keep food for long periods. We can trade food. So it didn't mean starvations or epidemics. Earlier volcanoes, earlier episodes did mean that. It meant poor food supplies. Climate change meant animals and plants were shifted and moved around, and that meant new epidemics. As people got hungry, as they became starving, as they became desperate, they often turned to fighting each other for the supplies that were left. So what happened? Well, we got famine, plague, death, and war. Those 4 apocalyptic figures. A couple of other things apart from volcanoes. You get this thing called the El Nino, which I'm happy to explain, but it would take a little bit of length. And that's connected to volcanoes. It's connected to the amount of energy the sun lets out. But during dramatic El Ninos, that can affect climate all around the world. So you get the same sort of horrible things happening, not just in the Pacific, but also in Europe, in the Middle East, and these are global climate events. So here is what happens. You get hunger, and then you get famine, plague, death, and war. My 4 guest speakers for the day. Imagine you are living in a really appalling time like this. People are starving. People are dying of epidemics or pandemics, a concept we are sadly very familiar with today. How do people respond? And if you're around in 1300 or 1600 or 1800, what you do is you look to your religious responses. And they will be different in different parts of the world. For Christians, they turn to the apocalypse. For Buddhists or Muslims or Hindus, they turn to their resources. But there are a number of different ways that people can respond. And what I'm going to suggest is, if you look at these different ways, they shape our religion today. I'm going to be talking about 4. One is hating. You can look for people to blame for the bad stuff that is happening around you. And some of the figures you see are just amazing. There's one analysis of anti-Jewish violence in Europe over like a 500-year period. And what it says is, and this sounds ridiculously kind of mechanical, when the temperature drops by 0.5 degree Celsius, there is a very significant, like 40% increase in the likelihood of anti-Jewish violence or pogroms. That's violence against Jews, and elsewhere in the world, it might be Muslim violence against Christians. You pick the minority, they will be hated, and they will be singled out for destruction. Hating is a big factor, and that decides, those great climate catastrophes decide why religious groups are where they are in the world. So for instance, in the 1300s, there's one of these dramatic climate shocks. Christians in Western Europe decide, obviously, whose fault is it? It must be the Jews. Let's kill the Jews. Many Jews escape to Eastern Europe, and that's where they remain from that climate shock right up until the time of the Holocaust. If you think of the Jewish world of Eastern Europe, it's there because of that climate shock. As I'll be explaining, the reason Muslims aren't in Eastern and Central Europe is because of another climate shock. So when you look at the map of the world's religious believers, why they are where they are, often it's because of these great moments of what I call hating. Here's another response: fleeing. Imagine that you are being persecuted in one country, you're being blamed for all the terrible things that are happening. You move to another place. Maybe you go by land. In later centuries, maybe you go by sea. There's a huge climate shock around the year 1680. We can talk about that. That sort of matters to us because people get out as fast as they can, and they go to places that'll accept deviant religious believers. A lot of people from Germany and Britain go to, where else? Pennsylvania, founded 1682 as a refugee colony for deviant, persecuted believers. You can say that the reason Pennsylvania is there is because of a climate shock. And I can give you a great many other instances like this. Reviving is another solution, and you might say things are so bad. We have all these terrible things happening around us. This must mean that our religion has become so weak that we must have a great revival. We must get back to things as they were. God is angry with us. How can we make sure that we have sated God's anger? And so you have a revival. And that's what Jonathan Edwards is doing in 1741. It's the worst weather in the world. You have famine around the world. You have these epidemics. Why is this happening? Come back to this idea again and again. God must be angry with us. What can we do? In earlier centuries, they might have said, let's kill all the Jews. Let's kill all the heretics. In 1740, it's no. We have made a mistake. Let's get our religion back to the way it's meant to be in the Bible. And there's one other solution, my fourth one, which is dreaming. We live in the end times. Let's try and set up a new, pure religion. And as you look at new religions being born, look at the climate shocks, look at the conditions, and you will see, sorry, checking one thing very quickly, and you will see where these religions come from. Now listen, I'm not trying to suggest anything mechanical. I'm not trying to suggest we're all slaves of weather, slaves of climate, that this is true in every instance, nothing like that. But I am saying that there are enough cases like this to make it look as if this is a real factor. I went back and forth with my publishers on this, and I originally wanted to say how climate change drives religious revolutions. And that's sort of what I'm talking about. Great Awakening is a religious revolution. And they said, well, what do you mean religious revolution? So they eventually snuck in upheavals, which is the same thing, but doesn't commit you quite as much. There's a climate shock around the year 1320. How bad it is unbelievable. It means that there is it rains all through the summers. There are torrential rain all through the summers in Europe. It means that there's a climate catastrophe across the Middle East. Something has gone very bad. We are not entirely sure what it is. It looks really like a supervolcano has gone off somewhere. How do people respond? Well, think about it. This is a time when states aren't very strong. So if mobs want to go after their neighbors, they can pretty much do it. Round about 1320 is when people start saying, you're a heretic, you're a heretic, you're a heretic. So many of the stories that we think about, and here we see heretics being burnt, they grow out of the 4 or 5 years after 1320. It's that precise. When is the first modern witch trial with all the familiar allegations about sabbats and consorting with demons and so on? Interesting year, 1324. If you map witch trials and you map witch persecutions, they follow beautifully from these climate shocks. I'm sorry if I'm enthusiastic about this. These are very bad things, I know, but it is great for my my argument. In fact, you can almost do it if you find like a sudden persecution of heretics, sudden massacres of Jews or Muslims or whatever minority, sudden witchcraft trials. Then you start looking at the tables of volcanoes, and you're going to find, aha, it works beautifully. Anti-Semitism is not new in Europe in 1320, but almost overnight, suddenly the anti-Semitism becomes much more systematic and vicious, and a lot of the charges that are going to drive anti-Semitism right up to the time of the Nazis suddenly appear in that 4 or 5 year period. This is a picture from the 1320s, and it's about the trial of Christ. And look how very suddenly all the people around Christ suddenly start looking like vicious anti-Jewish stereotypes. And what's the consequence of this? Mass burnings, mass killings of the Jews, the heretics who are available. By the way, this is exactly what is happening in the Middle East at this time, inflicted by Muslims on Christians. The worst year for Christians in the Middle East in terms of persecution is, guess what? 1321. Egyptian Christianity is very, very strong up till that point, and doesn't cease to exist then, but is very severely hit. That's the age when they have the great blows against the churches and the monasteries. Christianity in the Middle East never recovers after that point. Christianity is very strong in China up until the mid-14th century. At that point, it vanishes. It basically ceases to exist. And oh yeah, I should have included a warning here. Our pictures today are not cheerful. This is one of the images that starts to become very, very common right about that time, and they go through the next couple of 100 years, of the dance of death. And you have all these very rich and powerful people, and as you see, death is what follows. How do people respond to things like plague? Well, they use religious responses to plague. They get together in very large numbers. They have processions, they kiss the crucifix, they pray together. And in case you're about to say, that is a really good way of spreading the plague even further, you would be absolutely right. So you have these processions and religious events that you and I these days would call super spreader events. And it's not for about 300 years until people say, you know, if this is an infectious disease, we really should be doing something different. But note the basic idea. When something appalling happens, like a plague, how do you respond? With a religious response. I couldn't resist this one. It sort of puts everything together. What happens in a time of this dreadful climate? You have the plague, you have the famine, and then you have the different parts of the picture. We die, we fly, and in the middle, I follow. I talk about 5 or 6 of these great climate shocks. And one of the greatest happens in 1560, and that launches the coldest period of what's called the Little Ice Age. It's hard to indicate just how bad this Little Ice Age is, but you go to Europe and you look at the great rivers of Europe, and they are absolutely frozen through the winters and into the springs. And this is one of the most famous pictures you will see in European history. It's painted in, guess what, 1562 by a great Netherlands artist called Peter Bruegel. And it's called The Triumph of Death. And it shows an army of skeletons and the dead, you could, I suppose, call them the living dead, invading a town, killing people. And it represents the vision of the end of the world that strikes about this time. Now, you know, I ask you, think about it. If you were living at a time like that, and be very, very grateful you weren't, and you're a firm religious believer, how might you try to understand these events? Well, one is you might say, God is angry, we must go and live in a more pious way. There's no way, for instance, if you're trying to understand the Reformation, why people would have put up with somebody like Calvin. No offense to Calvinists. If they hadn't believed that the world was on the verge of destruction and they had to go back to these absolutely basic principles and put somebody like Calvin in charge of their city, which they did following an earlier crisis in 1540. In the 1560s, you have religious revivals, but the other thing you have is an attempt to purge those evil religious believers who are trying to subvert society, who are making God angry. And it's not hard to find people. If you're a Protestant, you blame Catholics. If you're a Catholic, you blame Protestants. And the next 20 years or so are some of the bloodiest years in European history before the Second World War. France, for instance, is fairly neatly divided. It's got very strong Catholics, it's got a very large Protestant minority, and the two try to wipe each other out. And in that time, in the late 16th century, they managed to kill 2 million people, which is quite an achievement. I should have thrown in a couple of more cheerful pictures here to break the general theme, but this will do. There is a climate catastrophe in the 1560s. There is starvation. There is horrendous cold weather that runs through the spring. Crops can't be planted. Crops can't grow. It's an impossible time. You get famine, you get plague, and you get war. This particular instance is Catholics trying to wipe out Protestants, but I'm very equal opportunity. I could certainly include many pictures the other way. Things happen in this era which are inconceivable to us. This is from a little bit later, and it's something I'm sort of interested in. We're well aware of things like flooding, and that can certainly happen. This is the time in the early 17th century when Western Britain gets hit by a tsunami, which is not something you tend to think of in the context of British history. I say again, if something like this was going to happen, what would you do? You would look for people to blame. I'm going through these stories. I'm telling many sort of dreadful things that happen. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on one particular, just to give you a sense of it. The years after 1675 are some of the worst recorded in climate. Volcanoes are going off in the Pacific like firecrackers, and they're spreading these very bad climate episodes around the world. It's hard to imagine just how bad things are, but I just invite you to look at this picture here. And you see the great ice flows and icebergs, and you see how deep is that ice? I mean, it must be, what, 10 feet deep. That is a picture of the River Thames in London in 1683-84. You'll see somebody dancing on the 10-foot thick ice. And pretty soon afterwards, being good London people, they do the obvious thing, which is they try to make money out of it. So they build what's called a frost fair with all the stalls and shows and anything you want across the ice. And those ice fairs, those frost fairs, are a regular item every climate shock in British history for about 300 years. The last one's in the early 19th century at the end of the Little Ice Age. But if you want to imagine how bad things could be, well, you know, if you're trying to make money, it's excellent. But think of what that means around the country, and know that when you get weather that bad, it is going to be followed by plague fairly rapidly. And I could almost have a guess what happens next. We lead into one of the great times of the European witch trials. My crops won't grow. The rain won't fall. The rain is falling too much. We're all starving. We're all sick. Let's find somebody to blame. And if you look at the history of witchcraft, it goes in a series of waves when different books get written and different theories emerge, and they correspond perfectly. 1320, 1560, 1680, happens throughout. I'm not going to do a whole lot more, but I'll just say one thing very quickly. If you're looking at this, by this point, you can almost predict what's going to happen. Can I say this forcibly? We tend to think of certain things happening in history, okay? We think of witch trials, we think of massacres of Jews, we think of Protestants and Catholics trying to kill each other. Please remember, these are not the normal thing. They don't just happen every year. Things can go perfectly well for 30 years, 40 years, there's no trouble. Then you get these climate shocks, and that's when things accelerate, and they happen in such a way that they cannot be reversed. There's no way we can go back to the old world. In 1679, right at the moment of this horrible climate shock, the Protestants suddenly decide that they're all about to be wiped out by Catholics. What happens is there are always people going around spreading conspiracy stories. Hey, that's something we know about today, right? If you like, they're spreading fake news about the Pope has decided to kill us all. And normally people say, you know, you're a crazy person, go away, we don't believe you. But when things are so bad out in the outside world, you believe. So what do you get? You get hating. You get fleeing as people escape to different countries. You get reviving, and you get dreaming. And if you want to look at the history of our religious systems, look at those four things. Look at the reasons why Jews are located where they are in history, why Muslims, why Christians are related. And remember also that this is not just a Christian thing. It's not just a British thing. It's not a European thing. You see exactly the same things happening with Buddhists, with Muslims around the world. One thing I found was, as I wrote the history of some of these cycles and trends in Europe, I was describing almost exactly what was happening in Japan. Europe's not influencing Japan, Japan's not influencing Europe, but they have a problem. They share one planet, they share one climate. And what I'm going to be talking about over the next couple of sessions is how these ideas, I think, are going to affect the world in the next 30, 40 years. As climate affects the global south, especially Africa, Asia, Latin America, we're going to see the same there. We're going to see hating and fleeing and reviving and dreaming. And maybe what we'll be looking at is the emergence of whole new religious responses. And I promise that if I do a program again in the future, and I will talk to Kevin about this, I'll try to make it cheerful and sunny, but this has not been one. And I'm sorry about that. But what I will do at that point is I will end my particular part and throw open for any questions. And I will throw over to Professor Lowe.